this week is a really interesting topic for me, the inner critic. And it comes up so much in the work that I do with writers, this voice in the mind that is critical, that really wears us down. So the reason that I talk about the concept of befriending the inner critic is to start to shift the way that you're interacting with this voice. Because more often than not, when you hear that voice, the reaction is a negative reaction. The reaction is that we hate the voice, that we wish it wasn't there. But essentially, that voice is a part of you. So whenever you're having a negative reaction to that voice, you're experiencing the negativity of reacting negatively to yourself. So as you can see, there's a lot of negative going on. So when we learn to befriend the inner critic, what then shifts is that we are beginning to think of ourselves in a more positive way. And of course, when we start to think of ourselves more positively, we feel better. And of course, when we feel better, we write more. So 2 practices today that are going to begin to help you to understand what's going on with the inner critic, why it's there, why it's saying what it's saying, and how we can shift our relationship with it so it's not a case of enemies going head to head. So I want you to imagine that that voice of the inner critic is essentially your safety coordinates. It's a voice that's trying to just keep you in a certain place. So anytime you want to come out of that place, the voice comes up because it knows that your reaction to that is to step back, to stop. So for example, you're setting out to write and the voice might say, you're no good at this. And often, if it says it enough, it can stop you in your tracks. And so it keeps you in this same terrain. The trouble is, if we listen to that voice, if we stick to those coordinates, the terrain remains the same. So at the moment, we're walking this very narrow plateau, and every time we try to take a step in either direction, the inner critic pops in and it keeps us in our place. So what we want to do is we want to find a way to begin to expand the terrain that we move in. And of course, you can imagine how you're going to feel. No longer are you having to take very small steps in this very constricted place, but you can start to become much freer. And I don't think there's a single writer that I've spoken to who hasn't said at some point that they want to feel freer in their writing. Who doesn't want to feel like they can just write whatever they want to write and that it's going to be okay? So what I want you to do for the first exercise is to take one common phrase that your inner critic likes to dish out, and I want you to shift it to give that phrase potential. Okay, so let me explain this one. So for example, if I take a common phrase that I hear my inner critic say, you're no good. Okay, so that's the common phrase, one thing that your inner critic says. For me, you're no good. And then I'm going to shift it to give it potential. So the way that I'm going to shift it could be, with practice, you could be amazing. So the reason that this is so important is when we hear that voice, the inner critic, saying, in my case, you're no good, if I listen to it and I stay within the same territory, I'm acting as if that's true. I'm hearing it and I'm saying, oh yeah, it's true, so I'm going to stop what I'm doing. And so there becomes no way out. I become continuously stuck in a place where I'm no good with my writing. As soon as we start to shift our reaction to it in the, okay, currently I may not be any good, but that can change. So we start to look at the possible way out. I'm no good, but with practice, I could be really great. So we're going to spend 2 minutes writing on that place of shift. So we'll start with the phrase that the inner critic dishes out. So for me, it's you're no good. And then you're going to spend 2 minutes writing on the potential that that phrase can be and what that's like. So 2 minutes, off you go. Okay, so let's just take a moment to reflect. This exercise is really powerful because what it will start to create is a different relationship that you're having with that voice in your mind. So currently, when you're hearing the inner critic, there's this experience of that's just how it is, like a dead end. You're no good. When you start to get curious about the potential, and I always have this experience when I begin to write from this angle when I'm dealing with the inner critic. When you start to shift, you start to hear the inner critic saying something differently. So for me, when I hear my inner critic say, "You're no good," it's like it just cuts everything short. But when I start to journal in this place of, with practice, you could be really good, suddenly the inner critic ceases to be the enemy and starts to turn out to be a friend with some really good advice. I'm aware that it's there to keep me safe. I'm aware that it's there to keep me on terrain that is going to enable me to stay upright and not fall over. But when we start to shift and see the phrases of the inner critic in terms of the potential, we actually understand that the inner critic wants us to do well. It keeps us safe, but it also wants us to do well. And that's when the relationship becomes much more rewarding. We start to see our potential. So we're essentially looking at the way we behave when we hear the inner critic pipe up. So what do you usually do when that voice appears in your mind? Do you start to struggle? Do you get up and go make yourself a cup of tea and start hoovering and doing the washing up and phoning friends so that you don't have to get back to your writing? If you're doing things like that, you're essentially proving to yourself that you don't have what it takes, or you're really no good at this, or that you are a failure. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what we want to start to look at is how we can behave as if it's a sunny day. And then we realise that actually the rain cloud isn't there. We just thought it was there. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to take another phrase that the inner critic comes up with, and it might be that you want to continue to work with the same one. For me, I have various different phrases that I know that the inner critic likes to use. So I'm going to choose a different one, but it's completely up to you which one you want to choose. So take a phrase that the inner critic will say to you, and you're going to turn it around. So what you're going to do is you're going to describe how you would behave if the phrase that the inner critic was saying was the opposite. So for example, if my inner critic says to me, "You're a failure," what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the phrase around, "You're a success," and then I'm going to describe how I would behave knowing that one was true. 2 minutes, off you go. Okay. How was that one? Taking that phrase, turning it around and acting as if this opposite truth were true. So essentially, we're no longer acting as if it's raining outside, we're acting as if the sun has come out. So this was really interesting for me to reflect on as I was writing, because I'm very much in mind of how my writing used to be and how my writing is now. And so I started with the phrase, "You're a success," because for me that was a phrase that I heard so often from my inner critic, that you're just failing at this whole writing malarkey. So I put, if I heard "you're a success," I would be getting to my writing first thing. I would be absolutely ensuring that no matter what, I made sure I had time each day to write. And it was really interesting for me to write that, because there was a period in my writing practice where I made that happen. So for me, I basically thought about a time of day where it was going to be incredibly rare for me to be disturbed, 5 a.m. And I made sure that I dedicated that time to write. So every day between 5 and 6 a.m., I sit down and I write. And I was only able to do that, to really commit to that, when I started to imagine how would I behave if I absolutely knew that I was going to be a success at this. Because if that inner critic is saying you're a failure, if you believe that it's raining outside, you're not going to put on your shorts and your t-shirt and go outside. You have to believe that the sun is shining in order for these really powerful practices to take root. So the other thing that that struck me when I was writing is that, so it's really obvious that I'm making writing a priority. I would also be proud to talk about it. And again, that's a huge shift for me. A decade ago, I was very secretive about the writing that I did. And now you can't stop me talking about writing. You know, I have an entire YouTube channel where I just can't shut up about writing, because I love it so much, because I love my writing practice. So a huge shift there. But the final thing that I wrote was, if I heard "you're a success," I would give my writing the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's a really important component to share with you, because it isn't that every day I wake up and it's 5 a.m. and I'm feeling like an absolute superhero and I'm just like dishing out all of these words on the page and it's all going fantastically well. What it means to really believe in myself as a writer is that in the days when I wake up and I feel tired and I feel like I haven't quite said it the way that I want to, I give it the benefit of the doubt, rather than say, oh, there we go, I always thought I was going to be a failure, well, I've gone and proved it. So if I have a day where I'm slightly off the mark, I say, that's okay, because I know that I'm going to be a success. So whatever happened today, happened. And I know that at some point it's going to pick up again. I know at some point I'm going to be able to see a way through. So we're staying with that positive perspective, and we're not slipping into what the inner critic is saying, you're a failure. We're saying, what if I was a success? If I was a success and I knew that I was a success, how would I behave? How would I do it? So really this work with the inner critic is about listening rather than just wishing it would go away, wishing it would shut up. So we're embarking in that very positive act of listening to ourselves, because the voice is coming from within. So firstly, we're listening to ourselves, we're engaging on some level, but we're also beginning to question a different perspective. We're beginning to question different habits, different ways of being, to prove the positive. So really, really powerful exercises, and ones that are really worth practicing. So again, this might be a video that you come back to again, just to remind yourself of those different ways that you can view the inner critic, and these two really lovely exercises that you can do with all of the different phrases that you hear the inner critic offer up. Great work today, well done, you've got through the video, and I'm really looking forward to deepening the practice and continuing work in a week's time. I'll see you then.